last 4 weeks, Reg, have shaped what could be a very unique future for the Dallas Mavericks, because what we have seen from this team over the last month now has been from euphoria with two individuals in Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving both going off for 40 points in a win at the AAC against the Philadelphia 76ers, to bookending that a couple of days ago with a loss to the Philadelphia 76ers that has his team now 3 games under 500 with 5 left to play as they get ready to take on Jimmy Butler and the Miami Heat. This is going to be cut number 10, Ruben. Cut number 10 with respect to Jamal Crawford. Jamal Crawford was talking about the Mavericks' recent struggles. And, of course, he's on NBA on TNT. Take a listen to what Crawford had to say about what he is seeing with the Dallas Mavericks.
The Mavericks' problem started in the summer. When Jalen Brunson left that team, they lost their identity. He was somebody Luka respected, but he was also somebody who can get it done and play with him as well. So when they lost him, they kind of lost their way. He was the winner in the fact that he can get Luka even on track. Yo, we got to get some good possessions. He was the quarterback, the thinker. Shout out to Jalen Brunson. He's been just as important for the Knicks. But when the Mavs lost him, they haven't been able to kind of find their way. Obviously, Kyrie Irving's a special talent. He's a special player. This isn't Kyrie's fault. You can't throw these two together and say, hey, figure it out with 20 games left in the West. It's this tight. So the Mavs, I'm throwing that lob back to you.
Yeah, February 12th, the Mavericks were the 4 seed. Right now, they're the 11 seed.
So while Crawford is obviously detailing one of the biggest storylines for the Mavericks going into this upcoming season with the loss of Jalen Brunson, what we have seen from this team post-All-Star break with the acquisition of Kyrie Irving and the lack of consistency that we've seen from this team, especially on the defensive end, gets us to what Tim Cato titled in his latest piece, which I found to be very interesting. For Luka, Kyrie, and these Mavericks, time is running out.
Mm-hmm. That seems evident, right? You have this season that is rapidly approaching its end, and they are currently on the outside looking in, not of the playoffs, but the play-in.
And with both players on the court, here's what's interesting. With both players on the court, the Mavericks are scoring 121.4 points per 100 possessions per cleaning the glass.
That's good.
Which would obviously make them the league's best offense if those minutes counted. I say that part at the end because they haven't played enough together to qualify, obviously, as being the leading, having the best offense in the NBA with those two on the floor.
Right, as I was about to say a rotation, but a lineup, right? You have these metrics for individual lineups, and of course, there's a qualifying number that they have not reached.
And I think that part is key here when we're having this discussion, because that has been the hallmark of the time of Kyrie Irving and Luka Doncic together on this team. Not enough time together on the floor to give us a better indication that they could have solved some of this, even with the lack of defense since the post-All-Star break, to be able to be in a better position going into this weekend. That's just simply has not been the case at this point.
Yeah. Jamal Crawford's right. There's only so much that you can do in the limited time that they've been given together, right? Especially, and this is going to come off as an indictment of Jason Kidd, and I guess take of it what you will, when you consider the Mavs have not been like the quickest to find the adjustments that work. It seems like they have to work through some things to find the adjustments that will ultimately be, beneficial for them. And with that dynamic understood, you bring in Kyrie and figuring out the ways in which, the right plays and the right sets and the right spacing that will work for this duo. It's taken a good long time, and I'm still not sure that they have figured all of those out. Like, I know that people inside the organization had a little bit of pushback at Zach Lowe, noted ESPN basketball writer and, opinion haver. And he was talking with Tim McMahon on one of his Low Post podcast episodes and discussing the idea of Kyrie, Luka pick and roll, right? Kyrie did, and LeBron did, had some pick and roll happen between them and those things, right? Like the idea of having those two playmakers that are really good, that force defenses to do different things, having a bigger guy and a little guy, get into the pick and roll, have things happen. They have not done that a ton, but when they have averaged 1.6 points per possession. And let me tell you, you don't have to know what, I mean, if you do know what that means, good, you understand. You understand why KG's laughing. If you don't, it's really freaking good. Like, you can end up with good possessions that are 1.2 something points per possession, right? So, but the fact of the matter is, I saw that Bobby Karalla at one point was talking about how, even when Kyrie was with LeBron, right, they probably ran it at about the same pace. But the thing about it, ultimately what I'm trying to get across is they haven't been able to figure out the things that work well to enough of a sample to be able to decide which ways they want to go about these things. And all the while, right, the idea that you're going to put up a whole bunch of points, that's dependent upon efficiency.
Yeah.
That's dependent upon not letting a possession slide here or there. And especially with the defensive effort and the defensive acumen that's been shown by this team. So with all of that here, they just haven't had a lot of time to get it together. Not to say that that's the only reason, but they just haven't had enough time, at least in that portion of it. Like the idea, if we're just looking at the high point of what we anticipated from this team, they have not been able to reach that ideal, if for no other reason than time.
And it's funny you mentioned the screening numbers for these two when it comes to Luka and Kyrie. Tim Cato points this out, that the two of them, Luka and Kyrie, have only set 45 screens for each other through the 13 games that they've played together so far, which is interesting because Jason Kidd had a little bit of a retort when it comes to why you don't see Luka and Kyrie in more screen and roll situations for each other, because he says, and I'm summarizing here, the idea is that Luka and Kyrie are generally having the two best defenders involved in that action. So how much are you actually seeing in terms of effect because of who is actually defending those two?
Well, again,
no one's dying.
1.6 points per possession, right? That's what you could point
Correct.
to. Although, right, the idea is the Mavericks typically, their MO is they're looking for weak defenders, and that's when they do. The screen and roll is not to bend the defense. It's just to switch matchups.
Yes.
My response to that response, right, which because I believe Bobby Karalla made that point, why is that what you are locked into, right? You need to have a certain openness to find a way to be good, especially with the parameters that you have. But yes, that is, I think all of that is there. I saw on CBS Sports, as obviously we just end up looking at all the sports stuff.
That's all right.
As we get ready for any particular show. And I saw on CBS Sports, there was an article that basically said, Kyrie is not the reason that the Mavs have been worse.
Which I think has been a general sentiment for everyone.
Yes.
Evaluating this
the
situation.
Secondary portion of that headline. But like Boston and Brooklyn, he has failed to make them better. And I think this is an interesting conversation to have as well. Because Kyrie, this might be one of the indictments that could be levied at Kyrie Irving. Right? When we talk about guys that are in the star class or even superstar class, depending on where you want to slot him, we don't have to have that particular discussion. A superstar you anticipate is not simply a floor raiser, but is a ceiling raiser. And you can look at Kyrie Irving's career and have a legitimate question as to whether he is a ceiling raiser.
That's tough for me because when Kyrie has been in the lineup by himself without Luka Doncic, this team has played pretty well.
Sure.
And the only reason why I bring that up is the roster around Kyrie and Luka in this particular case is not good.
Absolutely.
At least you can point to better roster construction in his previous stops, whether it be Boston or Cleveland, or even in the case in Brooklyn where ultimately it didn't work out. The roster here is not good enough for a ceiling to be elevated based on what you're asking Kyrie to do, especially when you decide to remove your best defensive piece in Dorian Finney-Smith.
That's what you had to do
to get Kyrie.
Right, it's what you had to do.
Along with Spencer Dinwiddie, obviously.
And that's going to speak to something that we're going to talk about even in more in depth, which is, the ways in which you can actually get better, right? As Kyrie Irving has asked about in some ways. But again, we'll talk about that at 8 o'clock now. But yeah, this is the thing that I have said about the Kyrie Irving thing. I think outside of that question, which I do think is legitimate, but we don't have to delve too deep into that, is it's easy to point to Kyrie and then talk about Kyrie's effect, good, bad, anything else. What has happened is that you've just laid bare the cracks that were in the foundation of this team to begin with.
Yes.
Right? And we can even take this back to last summer because Crawford and many other people have pointed back to like the error that was allowing Jalen Brunson to leave. Now we could talk about all the things that led to that and all the factors and pushes and pulls that led to that. That being said, there were cracks in the foundation at that point, even if you retained Jalen Brunson. And I think that's the interesting part of this is there a way, and are the Mavs up for the task of repairing those foundational issues with this team, while also understanding they have a preeminent goal, which is make sure that Luka is happy enough to stay.
Oh boy, and that gets to a larger discussion that we will have not just, a little bit here, but also throughout the course of the rest of this offseason, because the window that you're operating in here, Luka is in the first year of his rookie max extension. His fifth-year option is a player option, which for anyone in his situation, he would probably decline so that he can get back into the free agent market and get to his next max contract. I say that to say that basically after this year, you're working on what is a 3-year window, but technically it's really 2 if you're going to be the Dallas Mavericks. The reason why I say 2 is that if within these next 2 years, you don't find yourself repairing those foundational pieces that you're talking about, and finding a way to surround Luka and presumably Kyrie, if he's coming back to this team, with individuals that raise the ceiling both offensively and defensively, guess what happens in a couple years? If Luka decides to do this, he can start to go ahead and ask out. I don't think it's necessarily within him to do so. I believe the way that I've come to understand this player and come to, kind of understand his get down, that's not necessarily in him. He doesn't seem like a guy that's running or willing to run from a challenge.
Can I pose this question back to you? Did you think that was within Anthony Davis? Because I sincerely thought Anthony Davis was there for the long haul in New Orleans.
Yeah.
And he just looked up, and it just continued to be the Pelicans as an organization. And you look up in year 7, which again is even sooner than the time span that you were placing on this. And he was like, I can't do this anymore.
I think that's why, though, the Kyrie Irving move was so important.
Yeah.
Even if it doesn't work out ultimately for him staying here, what you proved to your superstar, your 24-year-old superstar, is that we are willing to do whatever it takes to take big swings to try and improve this team. That should be enough evidence for you, Luka, to see that over the next couple of years, we will do everything within our power based on what resources we have available to us to be able to make moves to try and get this team better. If that is the case, I think that gives Luka some reassurance that this team will continue to try and get better, which will lessen the appeal of wanting to possibly ask out. That's been my ultimate thing with this whole Kyrie thing, is whether it works out or not, you prove to your superstar you're willing to take a big swing to help figure this thing out.
That you're willing to take a swing, you also need to prove that you're capable of hitting, right?
Yes.
Of connecting, right? There's an interesting text that I'll read in just a moment, but to go back to the genesis of this conversation, the idea of the time that Kyrie and Luka and the rest of these Mavs had. Remember that the Kyrie conversation? This is an instance of recruiting from within. And we're going to get back to this quote. I read it verbatim yesterday, and we'll talk about it in an hour. Within Kyrie's post-game availability after the Sixers game, he basically asks, or basically lays out that one of the things that he's trying to figure out is why this team brought him here and what this team looks like going forward, right? And of course, he has some factor in that, but part of that is you need to convince him that there's something worth remaining for.
Yes.
And so in that way, there is some value to the remainder of these games, showing that there is a proof of concept, one of my favorite terms, that there is a proof of concept here in Dallas with Luka Doncic, Kyrie Irving, and the things that could be built there. Now, the text that I wanted to read that I imagine will serve as some level of tease for 8 p.m. From the 682. I hear you and agree, appreciate you, but we're one really good offseason away from the formation of a dynasty. And I actually don't think that that's true at all.
Oh, boy. That's a conversation we're going to have a little bit later on in the show. And I see your text 682. I'm going to address it on the other side of the break.